The smell of rain and gasoline always reminded Paul Vario of Brooklyn. Even as a young man standing on the cracked sidewalk of East New York in the late 1920s, watching trucks roll past and men in pressed suits shake hands under street lamps, he could feel it. That invisible hum in the air that whispered power, respect, and danger. It was the kind of world that didn't exist in books or newspapers. It lived in the glances exchanged between men, in the folded bills slipped across counters, and in the quiet understanding that rules meant nothing if you knew the right people. Paul wasn't born into wealth or privilege. His family had come from Sicily with little more than a few old photographs and a dream that life in America would be kinder. But Brooklyn was never kind. It was survival wrapped in brick and smoke. Kids learned early that fists and loyalty meant more than words. By 12, Paul had already learned how to run errands for men twice his age and keep his mouth shut about things he saw. By 15, he knew the difference between a man who gave orders and one who took them. There was a quiet confidence in Paul, even then. He wasn't loud like the other boys who bragged about fights or money. He was observant, steady, always watching how things worked, who collected what, who paid who, and who had the courage to say no. That calmness made older men trust him. In a neighborhood filled with noise, Paul had the rare gift of silence. The turning point came one hot summer afternoon when he was 16. A small-time bookmaker named Richie owed money to one of the neighborhood crews. When he tried to run, the man in charge, Tony Bells Bellini, needed someone to send a message. None of his older guys were around, so he turned to Paul. "You got a good head on your shoulders," Tony said. "Go tell Richie to come see me tonight. Be polite, but make him understand it's not a request." Paul nodded, heart pounding. It was the first time he'd been trusted with anything that mattered. He found Richie at a pool hall, laughing too loud, pretending everything was fine. Paul approached him calmly. "Tony wants to see you tonight. Don't make him wait." Richie froze. The laughter around him died instantly. Everyone knew what that meant. Richie looked at Paul for a moment, searching his face, then nodded without a word. When Paul returned to Tony, the older man smiled faintly. "You didn't yell, didn't threaten, just said what needed to be said. You're going places, kid." And he was. Over the next few years, Paul became one of Tony's most trusted runners. He learned how to collect without violence, how to speak with respect, but still command attention, how to negotiate when words could save blood. By his early 20s, he wasn't just another street kid. He was someone people listened to. But Paul wasn't content with being a messenger. He wanted more. He watched how the crews operated, how the money flowed from the streets to the bars to the bosses, and he saw opportunities everywhere. The numbers racket, the trucking unions, the bars that never closed. Everything was connected, and Paul, with his sharp eyes and quiet intelligence, started connecting those dots. By the 1940s, Brooklyn was alive with opportunity. The war had created shortages, and where shortages existed, so did profit. Paul began working closely with local businesses, arranging protection and ensuring that deliveries arrived on time, no matter what was happening with the unions. It wasn't just about money. It was about control. He built a crew of men who trusted him because he treated them with respect. He didn't shout, didn't humiliate. He believed in loyalty and reward. If someone worked hard, they got paid. If they made mistakes, he corrected them quietly but firmly. And if someone betrayed him, well, they simply stopped being part of the picture. The neighborhoods began to change. Families moved, new faces arrived, but one thing stayed the same. Paul Vario's name carried a weight. People didn't speak it loudly, but when they did, it was always with a mixture of fear and admiration. He had become the kind of man who could walk into a crowded bar and, without saying a word, make everyone lower their voices. By the late 1950s, Paul's influence reached far beyond Brooklyn. His trucking operations had expanded, his connections to the unions grew, and his reputation for fairness, tempered with quiet ruthlessness, made him one of the most respected figures in the underworld. Men from other boroughs sought his advice, and even legitimate businessmen called on him when they needed help smoothing out problems. But behind that calm exterior, Paul knew the truth. Power came with enemies. The bigger you got, the more people wanted a piece. The more you had, the more others wanted to take it. He'd seen it happen to men who thought they were untouchable. One mistake, one wrong word, one disloyal friend could end everything. One evening, as Paul sat in his office counting the day's receipts, an old friend named Frankie walked in looking uneasy. Frankie had been with him for years, running numbers and handling local collections. He closed the door behind him, his voice low. "Paul, I heard something. There's talk someone's been meeting with guys from the Bronx without your say." Paul didn't look up right away. He just kept sorting the bills into neat stacks. "Who?" Frankie hesitated. "Not sure yet, but the name Tommy keeps coming up." Tommy was young, ambitious, one of the new generation who saw Paul as the old guard. Paul sighed quietly. "Ambition's good," he said. "But ambition without respect? That's dangerous." That night, Paul sat alone in his office long after everyone left. The room was filled with the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. He thought about all the years he'd worked to build something stable, something that would last. And now, like every man who'd climbed high before him, he could feel the tremors beneath his feet. He poured himself a drink, staring at the amber liquid. "If they're testing me," he muttered under his breath, "they'll learn quick that I don't break easy." Outside, Brooklyn slept under the rain. The streetlights reflected on puddles, the air thick with the smell of diesel and smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a car door slammed, and laughter echoed faintly through the night. But inside that quiet office, Paul Vario wasn't thinking about laughter or noise. He was thinking about survival, about loyalty, about the fine line between being respected and being forgotten. He'd spent his whole life learning how to balance that line, and now, as new challenges crept in from every corner, he knew that balance was about to be tested again. For in Brooklyn, every man with power eventually learned the same truth. The higher you rise, the thinner the air gets, and the harder it becomes to breathe. By the early 1960s, Paul Vario had carved out a quiet kingdom. It wasn't the flashy, gunfire-filled empire outsiders imagined when they whispered the word mob. His power wasn't loud. It was silent, woven into the cracks of Brooklyn's daily life. Every trucking company that wanted to move goods through JFK, every construction crew that needed permits expedited, every union that wanted peace. Somehow, they all found their way to Paul. He'd built it on patience and strategy, not impulse. To outsiders, Paul seemed like a neighborhood gentleman, always dressed neatly, speaking softly, shaking hands at local gatherings. But underneath that calm demeanor, he carried decades of experience in a world where one careless word could mean ruin. The old crew from the East New York days was still around, though thinner now. Some had retired, others vanished, and a few, like Frankie and Pete, remained fiercely loyal. They'd grown older together, trading street corners for offices, brass knuckles for briefcases. But Paul could feel the shift in the air. The city was changing. New faces were coming up, young, reckless, hungry for quick money and faster recognition. They didn't understand the art of subtlety, the quiet diplomacy that had kept Paul's world intact for so long. They talked too much, drank too much, and thought respect could be bought with violence. And among them was Henry Hill. Henry wasn't Italian. He was half Irish, half Sicilian. But he had charm. A street-smart kid who knew how to talk to people, how to make anyone like him. When he first came around through one of Paul's men, he wasn't looking for trouble. He just wanted to belong. There was something about him, eager, yet dangerous in the way only a man who craved belonging could be. Paul noticed him right away. He saw a spark in Henry that reminded him of his younger self. Ambitious, curious, observant. So he took him under his wing, letting him hang around the crews, run small errands, learn the ropes. "Watch everything," Paul told him once, leaning back in his chair with a cigarette between his fingers. Don't talk too much. Don't make noise. Just watch. That's how you learn who runs what. Henry nodded eagerly, soaking in every word. It didn't take long for him to prove himself. Henry had a natural gift for reading people. He could tell when someone was lying, when someone was nervous, when a deal was about to go bad. He knew how to smooth things over, to make everyone feel like they were getting the better end of the deal. Paul liked that. He valued men who used their heads before their fists, but not everyone shared Paul's calm approach. Some of the younger guys in the crew, like Jimmy Burke, preferred faster, louder methods. Jimmy was Irish too, but unlike Henry, he didn't hide it. He was older, tougher, and had a temper that made people step back when he walked into a room. Still, Paul respected him. Jimmy brought results, and in this world, results mattered more than anything. For a while, everything ran smoothly. The union rackets were stable, the trucking companies paid on time, and the money flowed like clockwork. But deep down, Paul knew peace never lasted forever. It started with whispers, a small group of independent truckers trying to operate without paying tribute. Then, a shipment of goods disappeared from a warehouse that Paul controlled. At first, he thought it was bad luck, but when it happened again, he knew it wasn't chance. Someone was testing boundaries. One night, Paul called a meeting at his restaurant on Rockaway Parkway. The place was closed to the public, the lights dim, the air thick with cigar smoke. Around the table sat his most trusted men, Frankie, Pete, Jimmy, and Henry. Paul spoke calmly, as always. "We've got a problem," he began. "Someone's cutting into our routes. They're not paying their dues, and worse, they think we won't notice." Jimmy leaned forward, cracking his knuckles. "Tell me who, and I'll make sure they don't forget who runs Brooklyn." Paul shook his head slowly. "No, we do this smart. We find out who's behind it first. Maybe they're working with someone from uptown. Maybe they're just stupid. Either way, we don't move until we know." Henry, sitting quietly beside Frankie, watched Paul carefully. He admired how the man never raised his voice, how he commanded respect without needing to threaten. Even Jimmy, who could explode at the slightest provocation, always lowered his tone when Paul spoke. Over the next few weeks, Henry ran errands, made calls, and kept his ears open. What he discovered surprised everyone. The men who were skipping payments weren't outsiders at all. They were connected to one of Paul's own associates, a man named Tony Russo. Tony had been with Paul for years, handling deliveries at the airport. He'd always been reliable, or so Paul thought. When the truth came out, Paul didn't get angry. He simply called Tony to his office one afternoon. The rain was coming down hard, streaking the window panes. Tony looked nervous, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "Tony," Paul said quietly, "I hear you've been running extra routes, making side money off our contracts." Tony stammered, "Paul, it's not what you think, just a little deal on the side. I didn't mean—" Paul raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "You didn't mean to disrespect me, I know, but you did. And now we have a problem." He didn't shout, didn't threaten. He just looked at Tony, his expression calm but unreadable. "I built something good here, Tony. Something that feeds a lot of families. When one man starts taking for himself, the whole thing crumbles. You understand?" Tony nodded, eyes wide. "Good," Paul said, standing up. "Then fix it. Quietly. No excuses." Tony left pale and shaking, and though Paul never saw him again, the problem vanished within days. Henry couldn't believe how effortlessly Paul handled it. No violence, no noise, just quiet authority. To Henry, it was genius. But to Paul, it was just experience. He knew fear wasn't in the shout. It was in the silence that followed. Yet as the years went by, the old ways of doing business started to erode. The new generation wanted fast money, hijackings, credit fraud, flashy scams that drew attention. Henry and Jimmy got deeper into those things, always pushing the limits. And though Paul tolerated it, after all, they were earning, he often warned them. "Keep your heads down," he'd say. "The feds aren't stupid. Every dollar you flash is a trail they can follow. But they didn't listen. Henry loved the rush, the sense of invincibility. Jimmy loved the control. And the more successful they got, the more exposure they brought to Paul's carefully built world. By the late 60s, Paul's empire was thriving, but so was law enforcement's interest. The FBI had begun monitoring phone lines, tracking union activity, and infiltrating crews. Paul could feel the heat even if the others didn't. He spent his nights sitting alone in his backyard, listening to the faint hum of the city beyond the fences. The world was changing, and not in ways that made sense anymore. Men like him, old school, loyal, patient, were becoming relics. The streets were filling with reckless kids who didn't understand that power wasn't about greed. It was about balance. He sighed, finishing his drink, watching the moonlight reflect off his pool. "You can't stop time," he muttered. "But you can stay one step ahead of it." Inside, the phone rang. Frankie's voice came through the line, uneasy. "Paul, there's talk. Some of the young guys are planning something big. An airport job, I don't like it." Paul's expression darkened slightly. "Tell me everything." The world around him was about to shift again, and for the first time in years, Paul felt that familiar tension in his chest. The kind he hadn't felt since he was 16, standing under that streetlight in Brooklyn, realizing the game never really changes, only the players do. By the early winter of 1978, New York was frozen in more ways than one. The snow piled high on the sidewalks, the air thick with the kind of silence only the cold can bring. But inside the smoky backrooms of bars and diners across Queens and Brooklyn, something was stirring, something big. A plan whispered in fragments, passed between hands and glances, building momentum with every night that passed. It began with Jimmy Burke, always restless, always chasing the next score. He'd been making money for years through stolen cargo and clever hustles, but this was different. A job so big that if it went right, everyone involved could vanish into quiet luxury for life. And the name that kept surfacing in every whispered conversation was Lufthansa. At Kennedy Airport, the Lufthansa cargo terminal was a goldmine hidden in plain sight. Every week, cash shipments arrived from West Germany, millions in untraceable bills intended for currency exchanges. But for the right people, with the right access, it was a dream waiting to be taken. Henry Hill was the one who brought it to Jimmy's attention, or at least that's how he told it later. He'd gotten the tip from a friend who worked at the airport, a nervous little guy who knew which flights carried the money and when. Henry, ever the middleman, saw potential. He brought it to Jimmy, and Jimmy, with his sharp grin and calculating eyes, began sketching out what would become one of the most daring heists in American history. Paul Vario, though, was skeptical. He sat in his small office behind the restaurant, listening to Henry outline the plan in eager bursts. The young man's eyes gleamed with excitement. "It's perfect, Paul. 6 million in cash, maybe more. No one gets hurt, no attention. We're in and out." Paul leaned back in his chair, silent for a moment. The hum of the refrigerator filled the gap between them. 6 million, he repeated softly. "That kind of money doesn't move quiet, Henry. Not now, not ever." Henry pressed on. "We've got inside access. The guy who works security owes us. Jimmy's putting together a solid crew, professionals. It's clean, I promise." Paul's gaze hardened slightly. "You can't promise anything in this life, Henry. Especially not clean. Big jobs attract big problems." Henry hesitated, but Paul waved him off. "I'm not saying no. I'm saying be careful. Don't let greed blind you." It was advice Henry wouldn't fully understand until much later. Still, the plan moved forward. Jimmy assembled a crew of men he trusted. Tommy DeSimone, the volatile young soldier with a short fuse, Frankie Carbone, quiet but reliable, Angelo Sepe, Louis Cafora, and several others who had one thing in common. They were desperate for a big payday. Paul, as always, stayed in the shadows. He didn't want his name attached to anything that could explode in the newspapers. He'd learned long ago that survival in their world depended not just on what you did, but on what people couldn't prove you did. The night before the heist, Henry couldn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table, cigarette after cigarette burning down to ash. He kept replaying the plan in his mind, the timing, the guards, the trucks. Jimmy's words echoed in his head. Stick to the plan, and we'll all be millionaires by morning. And in the cold early hours of December 11th, 1978, it happened. The job went off almost flawlessly. A few guards were roughed up, tied down, and within an hour, nearly $6 million in cash and jewelry disappeared from the Lufthansa vault. It was the largest cash robbery in American history. The city woke up to chaos. Newspapers screamed headlines of audacious airport robbery. The FBI flooded JFK with agents. No one had any idea who did it. For Paul, it was a double-edged sword. On one hand, his people had pulled off something legendary. On the other, legends attract attention. He could already see the danger building like a storm behind every celebration. A few nights after the heist, Paul sat in his restaurant again, listening to the radio murmuring news updates about the investigation. Henry walked in, still buzzing from adrenaline. You see it? He grinned. They got no clue. Nothing. It's perfect. Paul looked up slowly. Nothing is perfect, Henry. Henry frowned, confused. What do you mean? Everyone's happy. Jimmy's already talking about what he's gonna buy. That's exactly the problem, Paul interrupted, his tone calm but edged with quiet warning. When men start spending before they even count the money, that's when the feds start asking questions. Henry hesitated. He wanted to argue, but he couldn't. Deep down, he knew Paul was right. And Paul's fears weren't unfounded. Within weeks, the aftermath of the heist started unraveling the lives of everyone involved. Jimmy had told everyone to lay low. No flashy purchases, no new cars, no showing off. But one by one, the crew ignored him. Carbone showed up at a bar wearing an expensive fur coat for his wife. Another guy bought a brand new Cadillac. Word spread fast, and soon, enough, so did suspicion. Paul sat quietly through it all, watching from a distance. He wasn't involved directly, but in this world, proximity was as dangerous as participation. The FBI began tightening its grip around the Lucchese family, following leads, tapping phones, and watching every move. And then people started disappearing. One by one, members of the crew who'd participated in the Lufthansa heist vanished without explanation. Henry didn't need to ask who was behind it. He knew Jimmy. Jimmy didn't trust anyone. If he thought someone might talk, he'd make sure they couldn't. Paul kept his distance. When Henry came to him one afternoon, nervous and rambling, Paul cut him off gently. Listen to me, kid. This is what happens when men forget the rules. They get greedy, they get sloppy, and then they get buried. You want to survive in this life? Keep quiet. Keep small. Don't let anyone think you're more important than you are. It was advice that came from decades of watching men rise and fall. And as Paul spoke, he felt that familiar ache of age creeping in. He'd spent his life building something stable, something built on loyalty and order. But now it was all crumbling under the weight of new blood that didn't understand restraint. At night he'd drive alone through the neighborhoods he'd once controlled completely. Flatlands, Brownsville, East New York. The old bars were closing, the old faces gone. The city's heartbeat had changed. Faster now, more chaotic. One evening, he stopped by an old bar that used to be his hangout back in the 40s. The same cracked counter, the same faint hum of the jukebox. The bartender, a man half Paul's age, looked up and smiled awkwardly. Didn't expect to see you around here, Mr. Vario, he said. Paul gave a small smile. Just passing through. Wanted to see what's left. He sat at the counter, ordered a whiskey, and looked around. There were no more familiar faces. Just strangers chasing the same illusions he'd once chased himself. Money, power, respect. He realized then that every generation in this life made the same mistakes, only dressed in different clothes. When he returned home that night, The phone was ringing. It was Frankie. His voice was strained. Paul. The feds raided one of the warehouses. They're looking at everyone connected to the airport, even you. Paul closed his eyes, rubbing his temples. All right, he said quietly. We'll handle it, like we always do. But even he knew this wasn't like before. The world had changed. The rules had shifted. And for the first time in decades, Paul Vario, once the unshakable king of quiet control, felt something he hadn't felt since he was a teenager running from the cops through the alleyways of Brooklyn. He felt uncertainty, because no matter how careful he'd been, no matter how quietly he'd ruled, the echoes of other men's greed were now reaching his door. And in the distance, sirens began to wail. The winter of 1979 came colder than anyone could remember, a heavy gray blanket draped over New York that seemed to match the mood in every back room, bar, and corner diner in Brooklyn. For months after the Lufthansa heist, the city buzzed with rumors. Everyone wanted to know who pulled it off, and everyone in the underworld seemed to have their own version of the story. But in truth, no one outside the inner circle really knew. That secrecy should have protected them. Instead, it became their curse. Jimmy Burke had started changing. The man who once laughed through card games and shared drinks with his crew was now restless, paranoid, sharp-edged. His calls grew shorter, his temper shorter still. Every time he looked over his shoulder, he saw shadows that weren't there. And when Paul Vario heard about Jimmy's behavior, he knew the clock was ticking. He was sitting in his small office one evening, the hum of the neon sign outside flickering through the window when Henry walked in. He looked thinner, worn down, his confidence from the heist long gone. Paul, it's getting bad, Henry said quietly. Guys are disappearing. Tommy, Carbone, even Luis. They're just gone. Jimmy won't talk to anyone. Nobody knows who to trust anymore. Paul didn't respond right away. He looked at Henry, seeing in him the fear that came when the easy money turned heavy. You wanted the big score, Paul said softly. Now you're paying for it. Henry frowned. We all made him rich, Paul, and now he's tying up loose ends. Paul sighed. That's Jimmy. He doesn't see people, he sees risks. And when he starts seeing risks everywhere, no one's safe. Henry leaned forward. What about me? Paul gave a weary smile. You're still useful. For now. But you better start thinking about the day you're not. It wasn't cruelty. It was realism. Paul had seen too many men pretend they were untouchable right up until they disappeared. He'd built his life by avoiding those mistakes, by knowing when to step back and when to move quietly. But this time, even his caution couldn't protect him completely. The FBI had started tightening its web. They'd picked up on a string of stolen cargo, some old racketeering leads, and, more dangerously, they were now connecting dots between the Lucchese crew and the Lufthansa robbery. Paul's name was whispered in the reports, not as a suspect, but as a person of interest. To the Bureau, he was an old player who might have known something. To the streets, he was still a boss. But to Paul, he was a man standing in the middle of a storm that wasn't his, but could still destroy him. A few weeks later, he was summoned to meet with Jimmy at a quiet spot in Howard Beach. The restaurant was almost empty, the low hum of a jukebox filling the silence between their words. Jimmy looked pale, jittery, his eyes darting around. They're watching me, Paul, he said abruptly. I know it. I seen cars outside the house, same ones, different days. They're listening too. I can feel it. Paul stayed calm. You brought this heat, Jimmy. You can't steal $6 million and expect the world to stay quiet. Jimmy leaned closer. We could have handled it, but these idiots, those guys, you told them to keep quiet, and they didn't. They got greedy. You can't trust anyone anymore. Paul raised an eyebrow. You think I don't know that? The tension between them was subtle but real. Paul had always believed in structure, rules, boundaries, discipline. Jimmy, on the other hand, believed in results. And now, those differences were starting to surface like cracks in old concrete. When Paul left the restaurant that night, he knew something fundamental had shifted. Jimmy wasn't just paranoid, he was unraveling. And men who unraveled in their business had a way of dragging everyone down with them. Meanwhile, Henry was spiraling. The money that once seemed endless was gone as quickly as it came. The bars he used to laugh in now felt heavy, filled with whispers about who'd be next. Every time a car slowed near his house, his heart jumped. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating. Paul noticed. He'd seen that look before, the face of a man on the edge of panic. "Henry," Paul told him one afternoon at the restaurant, "you need to pull yourself together, you're making noise." Henry looked up, his hands trembling slightly. "I can't, Paul. They're killing everyone. Jimmy's gone off the rails. I'm next, I know it." Paul studied him quietly, then said, "The ones who survive, Henry, are the ones who keep their heads when everyone else is losing theirs. You remember that." It was the best advice he could offer, but survival was getting harder every day. The FBI was relentless. They'd flipped small-time guys, picked up low-level associates, squeezed them for information. The more they pressed, the closer they got to the truth. And even though no one could tie Paul directly to the heist, his name kept surfacing in testimonies, whispers, and files. He started noticing small things. The same car, parked outside the restaurant for too long, the sound of clicks on the phone line, strangers sitting too quietly at the bar. He knew the signs. One evening, as Paul sat at home with his wife over dinner, the news played softly in the background. The anchor was reporting another arrest connected to the Lufthansa case. Paul put down his fork slowly. "They'll never stop," his wife said quietly. "They won't be happy until they take everyone." Paul didn't answer. He looked at her for a long moment before saying, "That's the thing about the feds. They don't need to be right, they just need to keep digging. Eventually, they find something." And they did. By mid-1979, the Bureau had built enough pressure to charge Paul with racketeering, extortion, and conspiracy. None of it directly tied to Lufthansa, but it didn't matter. They wanted a name, a scalp, a symbol. Paul Vario, the quiet businessman who'd ruled Brooklyn's underworld for decades, was suddenly front-page news. When they came for him, it wasn't dramatic. No dawn raid, no flashing lights, just two men in suits knocking politely on his door. Paul opened it, wearing his usual calm expression. "Mr. Vario?" one agent asked. Paul nodded. "You could have called," he said dryly. The agent gave a thin smile. "We figured this was more personal." As they led him out, reporters swarmed the front yard shouting questions. "Paul, were you involved in the Lufthansa robbery? How long have you known Jimmy Burke? Do you have any comment on Henry Hill?" Paul didn't say a word. At the precinct, he sat quietly, listening to the shuffle of papers, the clicking of pens, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. He'd been here before, decades ago, when he was just a kid. Back then, he was scared. Now, he was just tired. That night, as he sat in the cell, he thought about everything he'd built, the crews, the neighborhoods, the quiet respect he'd earned. He'd survived every storm, outlasted every rival. But this one felt different. This wasn't a street war. It was a new world, one where power didn't come from fear or loyalty, but from evidence and microphones. The old ways were dying, and for the first time, Paul realized he might not outlive them. When he finally got out on bail, Brooklyn felt strange. The city had changed while he was gone. The young guys didn't look up to him anymore. They barely knew who he was. The old haunts were quieter, older. Paul drove through his old neighborhood one night, the streets dimly lit, the storefronts closed. He parked in front of a bakery he used to visit and sat there for a while, watching the snow fall. He thought about all the faces that had come and gone, all the names that used to mean something. And for the first time, he wondered if maybe all the power, all the control, had just been an illusion, something men like him told themselves to keep going. As he sat there, The radio murmured another update about the ongoing investigation into the Lufthansa heist. Paul turned it off, exhaling slowly. He didn't need to hear it anymore. He already knew how the story would end. Paul Vario sat in the corner booth of Robert's lounge, a cigarette dangling between his fingers, his eyes half-lidded yet alert. The air was thick with chatter, the sound of glasses clinking, and Sinatra crooning from the jukebox. Around him, men who owed their lives, or their downfall to him, laughed too loudly, drank too heavily, and bragged too much. But Paul? He was quiet. He didn't need to talk to own the room. He ruled it just by being there. That night, however, something gnawed at him. It wasn't fear. Paul wasn't the kind of man who feared anything, but it was something like unease. A sense that the game he had mastered for decades was changing faster than he could read it. Henry Hill, his most unpredictable protege, had been acting strange. Paul noticed how Henry's eyes flicked around too much lately, how he talked faster, sweated more, how he'd vanish for days, on business that never quite added up. And then there was Jimmy Burke, brilliant, ruthless, always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Together, the two had made Paul millions. But in his gut, Paul felt it. Greed had turned their loyalty into something fragile. As the night wore on, Jimmy slid into the booth across from Paul, nursing a whiskey. "Heard some talk," Jimmy began, eyes gleaming with that cunning mix of charm and danger. "Lufthansa job's in motion. Gonna be the biggest one yet." Paul took a slow drag of his cigarette. "You sure about your people?" Jimmy smirked. "Always." But Paul didn't buy it. He had lived long enough to know one rule above all. No job was ever clean, no matter how careful. When the Lufthansa heist finally hit, it was everything Jimmy promised and more. Millions stolen, headlines blazing, law enforcement scrambling. But Paul wasn't celebrating. He'd seen this before. Big money brought big heat, and big heat brought rats. Days later, when one of Jimmy's crew turned up missing, then another, Paul sat in silence, sipping espresso, watching the smoke curl up like ghosts of men who used to laugh here. Jimmy was cleaning house, eliminating loose ends. Paul understood the logic, but he also knew the pattern. It never stopped. The paranoia only grew. Henry showed up at the lounge looking jittery. "Paulie," he said quietly, "Jimmy's losing it. He's whacking everyone. I think I'm next." Paul's jaw tightened. "You brought this on yourself, kid. You start flying too close to the sun. Don't cry when your wings burn." Still, Paul couldn't help but feel something for Henry. He'd taken him under his wing years ago, taught him how to move without making noise, how to make money without drawing blood. But now, Henry was a liability, and Paul knew it. Soon, the FBI raids began. Warrant after warrant, phone taps, surveillance. Agents were circling like vultures. Paul's careful world, built on decades of discipline, was starting to shake. He'd always told his men, "We don't deal in chaos, we deal in order." But now, even the most disciplined couldn't hide from a system built to watch and wait. One afternoon, sitting in his modest home in Brooklyn, Paul's wife asked softly, "Are you safe?" Paul looked out the window at kids playing stickball down the street. "Safe?" he repeated with a half-smile. "Nobody's safe. We just live like we are." Then came the betrayal. Henry Hill flipped. The news hit Paul like a quiet storm. No yelling, no broken glasses, just silence. The kind that cut deeper than any bullet. Henry, the kid he had trusted like a son, the one who used to bring his car to get washed, who used to sit across from him at Christmas dinners, he was now testifying, naming names, including Paul's. When the FBI came for him, Paul didn't resist. He didn't shout or plead. He simply put on his jacket, nodded once, and walked out the door. The neighborhood fell silent as he was led away, his head held high. To some, he was a criminal. To others, a king brought low. But to Paul Vario, it was just the end of another chapter. Prison wasn't unfamiliar to him. It was just another system with its own rules. Inside, Paul carried himself the same way he did outside. Calm, respectful, unshakable. Even the guards treated him differently. He wasn't just another inmate, he was Paulie. Still, the world outside moved on without him. The old ways of honor and silence were fading fast, replaced by greed, drugs, and recklessness. The younger generation didn't play by his rules. They wanted quick money, fast power, no patience. In quiet moments, sitting in his cell, Paul would think about the early days, the laughter, the loyalty, the order. He missed when a handshake meant something, when a man's word was worth more than gold. But time doesn't care about nostalgia. It grinds everything down, even legends. When Paul heard that Jimmy was gone and Henry was living under protection, he said nothing, just closed his eyes and muttered, figures. In the end, he understood something most men never do, that the real power isn't in the fear you create, but in the control you keep over yourself. As his health began to fade, he requested one thing, that no one see him weak. Pride was all he had left, and he wasn't about to let the world take that too. On a warm morning, light streaming through the narrow window of his prison room, Paul Vario breathed his last. No headlines blared his passing, no mourners lined the streets. But in the quiet bars of Brooklyn and whispered conversations over glasses of whiskey, men still told stories about him. The man who played the game longer than anyone else, and never once pretended it was about glory. He was the old guard, the kind of man who built his empire not with noise but with patience, discipline, and unspoken power. Even in death, his legend lingered, like smoke in a room long after the fire's gone out. The night was quiet in Brooklyn, too quiet for Paul Vario's liking. He sat alone in his dimly lit study, the faint hum of distant traffic slipping through the window. The world outside had changed, and Paul could feel it pressing against the edges of everything he'd built. His neighborhood, once governed by silent understandings and respectful nods, now buzzed with chaos, kids slinging dope on corners, men with no code waving guns like toys, and loyalty replaced by greed that burned hot and fast. Paul leaned back in his chair, an untouched glass of bourbon resting on the table beside him. He wasn't drinking much these days. The liquor dulled the mind, and in this life, a dull mind was a death sentence. His thoughts wandered back to the old days, Brooklyn in the 40s, when everyone knew who ran what block and what lines couldn't be crossed. Respect wasn't something you demanded back then. It was something you earned. Now, the old rules were slipping away like sand through his fingers, and the new generation, his own men's sons even, treated those rules like fairy tales. That evening, Tony Sticks Bellini, one of the younger earners, came by. Tony was smart, ambitious, and loud. Everything Paul used to be, minus the discipline. "Paulie," Tony said, dropping into the chair opposite him without being asked, "we gotta move with the times. You see what the Colombians are making? They're running the city while we sit here babysitting bookies." Paul looked at him for a long moment before answering. "You want fast money, Tony? Fast money's poison. It don't last, and it don't build." Tony laughed, trying to hide his frustration. "Respectfully, Paulie, your way's old. These new guys, they don't wait for nobody. You blink, they take your corners." Paul didn't respond immediately. He simply stared at the younger man until the silence felt heavier than words. Then finally he said softly, "You think I built all this by blinking?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Tony's smile faltered. He left soon after, muttering something about how the world had changed. When the door closed, Paul exhaled slowly. He knew Tony wasn't wrong. The world had changed. But the difference between surviving and falling in this life wasn't who could adapt faster. It was who could adapt without losing themselves. The next few months brought a wave of trouble. The feds were tightening their grip again, reopening old cases, tracking old contacts, and worse, the younger crews were starting turf wars, shootouts, robberies, heat everywhere. It went against everything Paul had spent his life controlling. He gathered his captains one evening in the back room of Robert's lounge. The smoke was thick, and the tension thicker. Around the table sat the men who'd survived everything with him. Old soldiers, tired faces, eyes that had seen too much. Paul stood slowly, leaning on the table for balance. "Listen," he began, his voice calm but firm. "We've lasted this long because we kept order. I don't care what's happening out there. Nobody moves without my say. You see a punk waving a gun on our block, you don't start a war. You pull him aside and you remind him who runs this place." Murmurs filled the room. One man, Frankie Keys D'Angelo, spoke up. "Paulie, these kids don't listen. They don't care about the old ways. They care about quick stacks and fancy cars. We're dinosaurs to them." Paul's gaze hardened. "Then it's our job to remind them who taught them how to walk." That night, as the men dispersed, Paul felt the heavy weight of his words. He wasn't sure if he believed them anymore. A few days later, a phone call came that would shift everything. It was from Jimmy Burke. His voice, gravelly and low, carried the tension of a man watching everything fall apart. "Paul, they're rounding everyone up, names, addresses, everything. They got a guy flipping on us. I don't know who yet." Paul's heart didn't race. It simply slowed. "Handle it quiet," he said. But in truth, there was no handling it anymore. Once the government wanted you, they didn't stop until you were either buried or behind bars. The next morning, Paul took a walk through the old neighborhood. He moved slower now, but his presence still carried weight. People nodded as he passed, some out of respect, some out of fear, and some just because they remembered when his word was law. At the bakery on 86th Street, the owner, an old friend named Sal, poured him a coffee. "You hear about those kids last night?" Sal said, shaking his head. "2 of them shot over $50. 50. This city's lost its mind." Paul stirred his coffee, his reflection trembling in the dark liquid. "It's not the city that changed, Sal," he said quietly. "It's the people running it." Later that evening, Paul met with his lawyer. The news wasn't good. Indictments were piling up, federal investigations branching across states. "They're saying you were part of the cargo theft rings," the lawyer said. "And they've got witnesses, Paul." Paul's response was simple. Witnesses come and go, the truth stays. But when he got home, he sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about what the truth even meant anymore. The truth was, he was tired. Not of power, not of control, but of the endless cycle of loyalty and betrayal. He'd played the game longer than most, and he had the scars to prove it. One night, his wife found him sitting on the porch staring at the streetlights. "You're thinking again," she said softly, wrapping a shawl around his shoulders. Paul chuckled. "You make it sound like a bad habit." "It is," she said, sitting beside him. "Every time you start thinking, something changes." He smiled faintly. "Maybe it's time it did." She looked at him, eyes filled with worry. "You're not talking about walking away, are you?" Paul didn't answer right away. He just listened to the crickets outside, the hum of distant cars, the echoes of a city that had once belonged to him. Finally, he said, "You can't walk away from something that's already walking without you." Weeks later, Tony Bellini, young, reckless Tony, got himself caught in a sting. His arrest made headlines. Drugs, weapons, federal charges. Paul's name didn't appear, but the whispers spread fast. The old man's crew was crumbling from the inside. At a quiet dinner one night, one of his oldest lieutenants leaned across the table. "Paulie, you know what they're saying? They're saying the Vario days are done." Paul took a slow sip of his wine. "Let 'em say it," he replied. "They've been saying that since '49. But deep down, he knew the man was right. The tide was turning. The old world honor, the calm negotiation, the quiet profits, all of it was fading under the weight of guns and greed. And though Paul still had his loyal few, he could see in their eyes that they were scared. Not of him, but of what the world was becoming without men like him at the helm. As he left Robert's lounge that night, stepping into the cool Brooklyn air, Paul paused at the curb. The neon sign flickered behind him, the sound of laughter fading into the hum of the city. He looked down the street where it had all begun, the same corners, the same stoops, the same shadows. But everything felt different now. He whispered, almost to himself, "The game doesn't end. It just finds new players." The cold wind off the East River carried with it a feeling Paul Vario couldn't quite shake, something between dread and inevitability. Brooklyn was changing faster than he could keep up, and for the first time in his long life he felt like a man standing in front of a storm with no shelter in sight. The younger generation, the ones who used to call him Mr. Paul with respect in their tone, were now whispering about how the old man had lost his touch. He'd heard the rumors, of course. In this world, whispers carried faster than bullets. One night, Paul sat alone at Robert's lounge after closing. The air smelled like stale whiskey and cigar smoke, the walls echoing with decades of laughter, deals, and secrets. He'd built his empire in places like this, dimly lit corners where the real business of the city was decided over cards and cash. But now those same rooms felt like ghosts of a past that was slipping away. Jimmy Burke walked in without knocking. His face was tense, his hair grayer than Paul remembered, and the weight of too many bad nights sat heavy in his eyes. "They're coming for us, Paul," Jimmy said. "The feds, the kids, everybody. They're tearing apart what we built." Paul didn't flinch. He poured 2 glasses of bourbon and slid one across the table. "You think I don't know that?" he said quietly. "You think I don't see it?" Jimmy leaned forward. "Then what are we doing? We got rats in the crew. Frankie Keys is talking too much and Tony Bellini's facing time. They're offering him deals, Paul. He's scared." Paul took a long sip and let the silence linger. "Tony won't talk," he said finally, though the certainty in his voice felt hollow. "He's young, but he's not stupid." Jimmy sighed. "He's scared enough to be both." For a moment, the 2 old friends sat without speaking. The hum of the city outside filled the silence. Finally, Paul said, "You remember when this life used to mean something? When a handshake was stronger than any contract?" Jimmy nodded. "Now everyone's got a lawyer and a microphone." Paul gave a small, tired smile. "The world changed, Jimmy. We didn't." The next few days were a blur of quiet panic and whispered meetings. The FBI had started rounding up small-time players connected to the Lufthansa heist, a job that had made legends out of some and ghosts out of others. Paul's name came up again and again in reports, though never officially. He was too smart for that, but in this world, even being whispered about could ruin you. Paul gathered his inner circle at a small restaurant in Queens, far from prying ears. Around the table sat the men who had been with him since the beginning, Jimmy, Frankie Keys, and a few others whose faces showed the strain of too many years and too many secrets. "We keep our heads down," Paul said. "No new deals, no new faces. Anyone gets picked up, they keep quiet. The less movement, the less noise." Frankie shifted uncomfortably. "And what if the noise comes for us, Paul? What if they already got it all?" Paul's expression didn't change. "Then we handle it like men, not cowards." It was the kind of statement that once would have inspired loyalty, but now it just earned uneasy glances. The younger men were tired of being quiet. They wanted the fast money, the new power, the chaos. Later that night, as Paul left the restaurant, he noticed a black sedan parked across the street. The windows were tinted, the engine running. He didn't need to see who was inside. He knew. The feds were watching. They always were. He drove home in silence, his mind racing through contingency plans. He'd been through raids before, through indictments and arrests. But this felt different. This time, it wasn't just the law he was fighting, it was time itself. At home, his wife Anna waited up for him, the TV glowing softly in the corner. She turned to look at him, her eyes tired but full of quiet strength. "They're saying things again, Paul," she said. "On the news. About your people." Paul sat down beside her. "They've been saying things for 30 years, he said gently. She placed a hand on his. "It's different now. They're not just talking about your people, they're talking about you." He didn't answer. He just stared at the screen, watching the headlines scroll across the bottom. Names he knew, faces he'd trusted, all falling one by one. The next morning, Paul went to see an old friend, an accountant who had been with him since the early days. Together, they reviewed papers, shell companies, hidden accounts. "If this goes bad," Paul said, "you make sure Anna's taken care of. No questions, no delays." The accountant nodded solemnly. "You always planned ahead, Paul. That's why you lasted this long." Paul smirked faintly. "Planning's easy. It's the people that ruin it." Later that week, the inevitable happened. Tony Bellini flipped. The news came in through a phone call from Jimmy. His voice was tight, almost strangled with disbelief. "He's talking, Paul. The kid's giving them everything. Names, routes, payouts. He even mentioned your name." Paul closed his eyes, his hand tightening around the receiver. "You sure?" Jimmy hesitated. "I heard the tapes. He called you the boss of the whole thing." For a long time, Paul said nothing. Then quietly he replied, "I gave that kid everything. A seat, respect, a future, and he gives me this." That night, Paul didn't sleep. He sat by the window, watching the lights of Brooklyn flicker like dying stars. Every betrayal left a scar, but this one cut deeper. By morning, the newspapers were already running stories about indictments, federal witnesses, and secret recordings. Paul knew what was coming. He'd been through it before, but age had slowed him. The men who once stood beside him were either in cells or graves. The loyalty that had built his world was now just an echo. When the agents came to his door 2 days later, he didn't fight. He opened it calmly, as if greeting old friends. "You boys finally made it," he said, almost smiling. "Took you long enough." As they led him away, Anna stood in the doorway, tears in her eyes. Paul turned back once, giving her the faintest nod, a silent promise that somehow she'd be okay. The trial that followed was long and public. The prosecutors painted him as the quiet puppeteer behind decades of racketeering, theft, and extortion. They called him a kingpin, a mastermind, a relic of an older, darker time. Paul just sat there listening, his expression unreadable. When it was finally his turn to speak, he leaned into the microphone and said, "I'm not a saint, but I'm not what you think I am either. I built a life the only way a man could back then, by surviving." The courtroom was silent. Even the judge seemed to pause before moving on. Paul was sentenced, though not as harshly as they'd hoped. His reputation as the quiet boss, the man who avoided violence, had earned him some sympathy. In prison, time slowed. The days blended together, the walls closing in tighter each week. But even there, Paul carried himself with the same calm authority he'd always had. The guards respected him. The inmates listened when he spoke. Jimmy visited once years later. They sat across from each other in the visiting room, both older, both ghosts of the men they'd once been. "You did good, Paul," Jimmy said softly. "Better than most of us." Paul gave a small nod. "I lasted. That's all that matters." When Jimmy left, Paul sat in silence for a long time. Then, almost to himself, he whispered, "But at what cost?" He thought of the old streets, the laughter at Robert's lounge, the long nights planning every move like a chess master. He'd outplayed everyone, except time. As the lights dimmed that evening, Paul lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. In his mind, he walked through Brooklyn one last time. The bakery, the bar, the stoop where it had all begun. And though he knew the world had moved on without him, somewhere deep inside, he took comfort in knowing that for a time, his time, he'd been one of the last men to live by the old code. The years in prison moved differently for Paul Vario. Days didn't feel like days. They felt like echoes. The world outside kept turning, changing, forgetting. Inside, it stood still. The same cracked concrete floors, the same metallic clangs of gates closing, the same tired faces wandering the corridors like shadows. But even behind bars, Paul carried himself with quiet dignity. The younger inmates might not have known his full story, but they knew enough to treat him with respect. He wasn't just another old man in prison. He was Paulie, the Brooklyn boss who once ran half the city without ever raising his voice. He had no hunger for control anymore, no schemes or power plays left in him. What he had instead was memory, and sometimes memory was a crueler prison than steel bars. Every night when the noise of the cell block died down, Paul would sit on his cot, close his eyes, and drift back to the streets of Brownsville. The sounds of laughter from neighborhood kids, the smell of bread baking from the corner shop, the early mornings when the city was still waking up. He could almost hear the rumble of the old trains passing overhead, carrying men like him to another day of hustling, surviving, pretending they were free. One evening, as he sat alone in the rec yard, a young inmate named Richie approached him. Richie was maybe 25, full of restless energy and sharp eyes. He'd been asking around about Paul, trying to understand who this quiet old man really was. "They say you used to run Brooklyn," Richie said, lowering his voice as he sat down beside him. "That true?" Paul chuckled softly. "Run it? No. Nobody runs Brooklyn. You just get lucky enough to be left alone for a while." Richie smiled. "Still, people respected you. Even the guards talk about you." Paul looked at the kid for a long time before answering. "Respect's funny, kid. You don't get it by asking for it. You get it by being the last man still standing when everyone else falls." Richie frowned slightly. "So, all that money, power, it didn't mean anything?" Paul picked up a small stone from the ground and turned it in his hand. "It means something while you've got it. Then it doesn't. The trick is to know the difference before it's too late." The younger man didn't say anything, but the words lingered. He kept coming back night after night, sitting beside Paul, asking questions about loyalty, about life, about choices. Paul found himself talking more than he had in years, not about crimes or deals, but about people, about how easy it was to lose your soul one favor at a time. "See, Richie," he said one night, "every man thinks he's the smartest guy in the room, but the real smart ones, they know when to walk out before the walls start closing in." Richie tilted his head. "Did you walk out?" Paul smiled sadly. "No, I stayed too long." Word started spreading through the prison that Paul Vario was some kind of teacher now, an elder statesman of the old world. Inmates, young and old, would come to him for advice. Some asked how to survive prison politics, others how to keep their heads down and make it home in one piece. He never glorified his past. He never called it the life. He just called it what was. But despite his calm demeanor, inside, Paul was haunted, not by what he'd done, but by what he'd lost. He thought often about Henry Hill, the kid he'd treated like family, who'd turned state's witness. Paul didn't hate him anymore. He was long past anger. Instead, he pitied him. He never understood the difference between fear and respect. Paul once said quietly to himself. That's what destroyed him. When news reached him that Jimmy Burke had died in prison, Paul felt something shift inside. Another piece of the old world gone. Another ghost added to the list. He sat alone that night, staring at the concrete wall and whispered, "So it's just me now." Outside, the world was different. The mob had changed, if it could even be called that anymore. The new generation wasn't interested in loyalty or codes. They were reckless, driven by greed instead of honor. The newspapers still used the same old words: organized crime, rackets, families. But Paul knew it wasn't the same. The soul of it was gone. One day, Paul received a letter from his nephew. The handwriting was careful but unsteady. It read, "Uncle Paul, I've been hearing stories about you my whole life. I want to know the truth. Were you really the man they say you were? Paul stared at the words for a long time before writing back. His response was short, written in his tight, deliberate script. I was just a man trying to make a living in a world that didn't give you many choices. Don't make the same mistakes I did. The hardest thing you'll ever do is learn when to walk away. Weeks turned into months, months into years. His health began to decline, but his mind stayed sharp. He still played chess in the yard with the guards, still walked with his head high, still nodded politely to everyone who passed. When the prison doctor told him his time was running short, Paul simply said, "I've had a long run. You can't beat the clock." The warden came to see him once before the end, a man half his age who'd grown up hearing the stories about Vario, the gentleman gangster. "You know, Paul," the warden said, "for someone who's been through as much as you have, you're surprisingly calm." Paul gave him a faint smile. "That's because I made peace with my past a long time ago. The only thing I ever wanted was to be remembered right." And then, as the warden turned to leave, Paul added, "Tell them I wasn't the worst of them. I just played the game by the rules they gave me." When he passed, there were no headlines, no crowds at his funeral. Just a handful of old friends, a few distant relatives, and a priest who barely knew his name. Yet for those who remembered, the ones who lived through that era, Paul's legacy was clear. He was the last of a dying breed, a man who had built an empire not on violence, but on control. A man who understood that true power wasn't about making people afraid. It was about making them believe in the illusion of calm while you held the storm in your hands. In Brooklyn, old-timers at Robert's Lounge still talked about him in low voices. Paulie was the real deal, they'd say. He ran things quiet, smooth, never needed to raise his voice. When Paulie said something, it got done. The younger crowd didn't always understand what made him special. They thought power was about noise, about being seen. But the veterans knew better. Power, real power, lived in the spaces between words, in the pauses, in the glances, in the calm of a man who didn't have to prove himself. Years later, a reporter wrote a small article about him in a local paper. The headline read, "Paul Vario, the quiet architect of Brooklyn's underworld." It wasn't flashy, it wasn't sensational, but if Paul could have read it, he would have smiled. It said exactly what he always wanted, to be remembered not as a monster, but as a man who played his hand the best he could. In the end, Paul's story wasn't about crime or money or power. It was about survival, about a man who walked through fire and came out burned but unbroken. And though time has buried his name beneath newer legends, for those who knew, Paul Vario remains a reminder of a world that once was. A world where loyalty meant something, where silence was sacred, and where one man could rule with nothing more than a quiet word and an unshakable stare. When Paul Vario finally passed, the news barely made a ripple. No front-page stories, no mourners lining the streets, no fanfare. Just a short paragraph buried deep in a local paper. Paul Vario, reputed Brooklyn mob figure, dies at 73. For most of the city, it was just another obituary, but for the few who truly knew his name, his death marked the quiet end of an era. In the old neighborhoods, the last of the gray-haired men still talked about him in hushed tones over espresso and cigarettes. "Paulie was different," one of them said, his voice raspy with age. "He didn't shout, didn't brag. You knew he was in charge by the way the room went quiet when he walked in." Another nodded. "He ran things clean, not like these kids today chasing cameras and headlines." But time doesn't pause for legends. The bars that once held his meetings were now coffee shops. The corners where his men stood guard had new faces, new rules, new chaos. The codes Paul lived by, respect, loyalty, silence, were relics now. Henry Hill, somewhere far away under another name, read about Paul's death in a small newspaper clipping. For a long time, he just stared at it. He had betrayed him, destroyed everything Paul had built. And yet reading those few printed words hit him harder than he expected. "Goodbye, Polly," he whispered, a tremor in his voice. "You were the last real one." Years passed, and Paul's story began to fade into rumor. The younger generation of mobsters used his name like a myth, half remembered, half invented. Vario ran everything back in the day, they'd boast.